about 20 years, I taught undergraduates in the Peace and Conflict Studies program at University College, a college very much like this one. And I became deeply committed not only to undergraduate education, but also to the principles of a liberal arts education. The Peace and Conflict Studies program was, I think in many respects, a quintessential liberal arts program, provided quintessential liberal arts education. And I've reflected over the years quite a bit on why I think that form of education is particularly important for the well-being of our citizens and the well-being of our society and democracies more generally. So I'm going to, in the next 40 or 45 minutes, give you a sense for some of my thinking on this matter. It's really only a snapshot because the conversation could go on for a long period of time. But I want to, if possible, impart a certain sense of empowerment, a certain sense of excitement about the possibilities that are present in places like University College and Huron College, the importance of a liberal arts education. As I was talking to the folks here, as we were discussing what I would speak about, there really is a palpable sense that this enterprise is under siege, that all we hear from, for instance, commentators like Margaret Wente in the Globe and Mail and many others, my favorite Globe and Mail commentator, is that universities are just basically wasting social resources and tax dollars, and they should be training people for the job market largely. And what point in this whole endeavor is a liberal arts education? Well, I'm going to try to address that question very directly. So the first thing I need to do is make sure I can change these slides. There we go. So my central question right here, I think we do live in a world that in many respects is different from the world of even fairly recent decades. It's an argument I've been making in my last two books, and I'm making again in the book I'm working on right now. An increasingly complex world with increasingly complex problems that unfold faster than they have before and often have a broader range of severe and often unintended consequences and unexpected consequences. So the issue then is, in this new world, which I call a turbulent world, can a liberal arts education help? And I want to just give you a little sense for some of the problems that are in the news today, things that we're talking about all the time. And the question I want to ask in the background as we just quickly review some of these problems is, are we preparing our young people effectively to engage in a democratic discourse and conversation about how our societies or humankind more generally should respond to these problems? Let's talk about Syria. We're all familiar with the gas attack that occurred in August. And there's something really almost primeval now in our reaction to the use of poison gas in warfare. When I went through the photographs earlier today of images associated with this gas attack, I had to admit it was just appalling. It was, I'd stayed away from most of the stuff I think a lot of us do. That young child there is about the same age as my son, Ben. And so our first reaction, this is kind of a line in the sand, right? These people have done something fundamentally atrocious, and our first reaction might be, bomb the hell out of these guys. But then you step back and you think, well, what is the situation on the ground there? In many respects, there are no good guys in this conflict. There are war crimes being perpetrated on all sides by all combatants in Syria. It's also true that the opponents to the Assad regime, at least a proportion of that, of the forces that are massed against and fighting against the Assad regime, are radical al-Qaeda affiliates who are deeply opposed to the kinds of social projects that we are engaged in our professional lives and in places like this university. So should we be engaged in a military action or supporting an American military action that even indirectly supports forces like that? And then there's the possibility something I'll talk about later, unknown unknowns. You launch an attack, and then there are unexpected consequences that kind of ramify through the political and strategic environment. And before you know it, you've got a knockdown, drag-out battle between, say, Saudi Arabia and Iran over the Persian Gulf. Because the Middle East, at the moment, is right on the edge of a massive conflict between Shia and Sunni communities. So, what do we do? And what role should Canada play in this particular conflict? Should we support the United States if it decides to use military force? We've had a reputation as supporting norms, the defense of human rights internationally, the responsibility to protect, for instance. How does that play out in this situation? And frankly, how many Canadians are thinking about this in those terms and have the knowledge and ability to engage constructively in that kind of conversation? The oil sands. Well, this is a little bit closer to home, something I've been writing about a lot lately. It's a pretty messy business, as we all know. But for the most part, Canadians have kind of turned a blind eye to this because, after all, it provides something like $15 billion of revenue in Canada on an annual basis, tax revenue, support for social services, employment, not just in Alberta, but across the country. We all are on the oil sands dole to a certain extent in this country. But we also know that not only does it despoil enormous tracts of land in northern Alberta and the boreal forests, but it's a major contributor to climate change. It's an industry that is fundamentally dependent upon extraction of a very carbon-intensive resource that will probably have to be phased out at some point in the future. We also know that this is an industry that, according to reports from the OECD and other groups of analysts, has fundamentally distorted the Canadian economy and has contributed, for instance, to a reduction in expenditure and research and development in the Canadian economy. One of the reasons we got a low innovation rate is because we're so resource dependent in this country. And I've been making the argument, too, that subtly the oil sands industry has been torquing the political conversation. I find it quite remarkable in this country that no political leader, I'll put this quite specifically, that no political leader can come out with the position, major political leaders, say of a federal political party, can come out with the position that the oil sands should be wound down over a period of decades. That would be politically fatal. There's certain things we can't say, can't talk about in this country. Now, we all know that the oil sands can only be exploited if we get the product out of the country. And we know that this has been enormously controversial in the United States, for example. But how many folks have enough knowledge to really engage in this conversation in Canada about whether we should be supporting our federal government in the development of the Keystone XL pipeline across the United States? And then if we don't ship the stuff by pipeline, will it go out by other means, say rail? And what are the implications of shipping it by rail? This is the Lac Mégantic catastrophe just a couple of months ago. Do we really want to be sending 50 or 60, 100 or 110 car trains out of the country every day with bitumen for foreign markets? And what does that imply for the safety of all the people living along those rail lines? Again, what do we do? This is an enormously complex issue. It's not clear what the answers are. And how many people are actually really well prepared to engage in that conversation and make those democratic decisions required? And then an issue that has been of great interest to me for many years is climate change. My work on climate change goes back to the 1980s. And this is, in some respects, a distillation of the kinds of challenges that I've been talking about. We know something's happening. The data are unequivocal at this point. You see some maps here of the world, 4 decades, each showing warming across different regions of the planet over the 4 decades, the 1970s in the top left, the 2000 to 2010 in the bottom right. very substantial change in climate, especially in the northern parts of the planet. So Canada is being substantially affected. We're seeing a warming in the neighborhood of 1 to 1.5 degrees Celsius in that part of the world, 2 to 3 times faster than elsewhere. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is about to issue its 5th assessment of the state of science with respect to climate change. And it's already evoked the people who support the science and believe the IPCC has engaged in a reputable process and a fair process for generating a balanced assessment of the seriousness of the problem. On the other side, you have many people who are enormously skeptical and think that this is all blown out of proportion and we're about to spend trillions of dollars to change the energy characteristics of our economy, to decarbonize our economies for no reason, with enormous harm to our society and to our children in the future. Both sides in this conversation talk about their children and talk about the well-being of future generations. How well are we preparing our young people and our citizens in this society to have this kind of conversation? How well are we providing a space for the kind of deliberative democracy that's required to come up with a fair assessment of what's happening and what we should do? Now, one of the critical issues here, this is a very dramatic photograph, isn't it? One of the critical issues here is the increasing incidence of extreme events, because it appears that climate change is going to increase the incidence of, for instance, drought, major storms, perhaps hurricanes, although it's somewhat controversial. This is Hurricane Sandy. You can actually tell a very good, well-grounded, empirically grounded story about how Sandy was, at least in part, made more serious and changed in its trajectory, forced onto the mainland of North America because of certain atmospheric features that have been influenced by climate change. So climate change does appear to have played a role in this particular catastrophe. But that raises the issue of attribution. When you look at a particular extreme event, a particular hailstorm or drought or hurricane, to what extent can you say that there's actually a connection to emissions of greenhouse gases? And what level of proof do we need? What kind of evidence do we need to make a judgment to drastically retrofit our economy and its energy systems? I like this particular slide. I find it very amusing. So just for those of you who might not be able to read, the monster is saying, and he's in the dock in a court, maybe that storm was one of mine and maybe it wasn't. You can't prove a thing, so you'll just have to let me go. And down in the bottom right-hand corner, this is, I think this is Gary Tolles, isn't it? The cartoonist is writing, this is a loophole you could lose a planet through. I think this issue of attribution is at the core of much of the controversy and conversation surrounding climate change. I don't think we're preparing our young people properly to engage in this kind of conversation and to make effective decisions collectively, together, to guide both Canadian policy and ultimately humanities policy in the future. So these are some of the challenges we face, the problems we face. I want to step up now to a higher level and talk about what I think are some of the sort of integrating features across these specific problems. So I think there are three. Basically, I'm going to make 5 arguments. I'm going to make 3 points about the nature of these types of challenges. I'm going to talk briefly about simultaneous stresses, about rising complexity, and about infoglut, which this infoglut issue is particularly important, I think, for the conversation surrounding liberal arts education. And then I'm going to, at the end of my presentation, spend a bit of time talking about what I think are 2 really important things we can do in response to these challenges. Cultivating a prospective mind, which is an idea I developed in my last book, The Upside of Down, and then enlarging the social space for deliberation. I think that's a critical role for liberal arts institutions like Huron College and University College at the University of Toronto. Now, these three properties that I talk about characterizing turbulent world's challenges are really very closely related to each other. I can spend quite a bit of time talking about the relationships between these things. In fact, in some ways, both simultaneous stresses and infoglut are characteristics of a world of rising complexity. But for the sake of my argument today, I'm going to separate these three. So let's spend a bit of time talking about the issue of simultaneous stresses. It's an argument I developed at some length in The Upside of Down. And if you want sort of a graphical image of it, it's a bit like increasingly our societies or our decision makers in our societies are like an individual or a person standing in a very large parking lot. Looking out across the parking lot, they see 6 16-wheel Mack trucks coming towards them at full speed from different directions. And they look at one, which is what we tend to do with our problems. We look at one problem, don't see the others, and say, well, we can step over here to get out of the way. But then they look at another problem and realize that they can't step over there. They're not going to be out of the way because there's another problem coming from another direction. And then they look at another, and after a moment, they realize that they actually have no escape route. And our response in that kind of situation is to kind of roll up into a little ball in the fetal position and hope it all goes away, you know? And I think increasingly in our societies, that's what we're doing in a world of multiple simultaneous converging stresses. It produces a kind of overload situation where we can't cope, where our conventional coping mechanisms, at the social level, institutions of various kinds are not capable of dealing with all the things that are happening. And there's quite a significant background of social science research that supports this kind of argument. If you poke around in work of people like Emil Durkheim and Talcott Parsons and Sam Huntington more recently, Sam Huntington's best work, his early work, you find overload kind of arguments where there's an idea that systems break down, social systems break down when stresses exceed coping capacity. And in fact, there's a whole body of research on revolution that makes social revolution, that makes essentially the same kind of argument. Going back and looking at the French Revolution in the late 18th century, in the early part of the 20th century, the Russian Revolution, more recently in 1979, the Iranian Revolution, what you find is common to all of these supposedly very different social phenomena is that in every case, the central coping institutions of the state were overwhelmed by multiple simultaneous shocks, stresses, and they just broke down as a result. And I think increasingly this is the kind of world that we are finding ourselves in. I've identified, this is a slightly modified version of the 5 what I call tectonic stresses operating deep under the surface of our social systems that I identified in The Upside of Down. And I think these are all operating today. I don't think a single one of them we're dealing with effectively. And we might think that overall things are relatively stable and we're coping, but actually to the extent that we're not addressing any of these things effectively and proactively, the underlying stresses, the pressure within the system is increasing. Notice I've got multiplication signs here. That implies that when you combine these things together, the whole problem is a lot worse than the sum of the individual parts. It's kind of like, and sounds a bit crazy, sort of sci-fi, but it's kind of like, the drivers in the trucks are talking to each other. And in the process of talking to each other, the trucks sort of metamorphize and change their shape and become a lot more dangerous because they're interacting with each other. And that's kind of the thing you see. I've just finished a paper with a number of other scholars looking at the relationship, for instance, between energy scarcity and the financial crisis, the energy shock and the financial shock in 2008. The relationship was actually very close. There was a very powerful synergy between the two events. If you remember, in 2008, oil prices went to $150 a barrel. It was almost exactly the same time that the global financial crisis went critical, with Lehman Brothers collapsing in September 2008. And it turns out when you unpack that relationship, there were all kinds of interactions back and forth between the financial and energy system that made both of those problems a lot worse and increased the kind of synchronicity between them. In fact, I have a term, I call that the phenomenon synchronous failure. There's the synchronicity, and both systems went critical simultaneously, and we faced, in the fall of 2008, the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. Rising complexity. As I suggested, this is kind of the macro issue, the overarching story, but I'm separating it out independently here. But multiple stresses can be seen as, in part, an attribute of rising complexity. Infoglut also, as you'll see in a moment. But let me focus just on the issue of complexity by itself for a second. When I talk about complexity with my students, and I teach a lot of students about complexity at the University of Waterloo now, I usually refer to an instrument like this, a wind-up clock, the kind that would sit on a mantelpiece made in the 1920s. I have one at home, and it works and it chimes every 15 minutes. Lovely instrument. And I say, you know, you can take this thing apart. You can break it into its pieces, its bushings, its flywheels, its springs, its screws, and things. And you can sort of look at all the pieces and say, oh, I understand how this goes together. You can have a completely reductionist understanding of the system, reduce it to its bits and pieces. And then when you put all the bits and pieces back together, you can have a very precise understanding of how the things go together. And if it doesn't work, if the clock doesn't work properly, and in fact, it's a meaningful statement to say the clock isn't working properly because we know what it means for a clock to work properly. You can usually attribute that problem to a particular part that's broken or bent or missing or something like that. So you can have a reductionist understanding. The whole is not more than the sum of the parts. Cause and effect are proportional with each other in these systems. Small causes cause small effects. Big causes cause big effects. This is a mechanistic or a simple mechanistic way of looking at the world. And unfortunately, what we've assumed in many respects, especially for instance in our economic policy making, is that our economies operate like simple machines, like clocks. Turns out though, that that's not really the way the world is. Maybe it was sometime, probably not. But increasingly, it seems like we're embedded in a whole series of complex, interconnected complex systems, which are very different from simple machines like that clock. So complex systems are more than the sum of their parts. They have emergent properties. They do very surprising things. You put all the pieces together and something happens, and you were never really expecting that. It's a little bit like you turn the last screw on the clock and finish it, and then all of a sudden, you know, it sprouts a couple of legs and looks at you and says, "Hi, I'm out of here," and walks out the door. And you'd say, "Where did that come from?" And with complex systems, you're always saying things like, "Wow, didn't expect that. Where did that come from?" Complex systems show disproportionality of cause and effect. Unlike simple machines where small causes produce small effects, big causes produce big effects. With complex systems, you can have small causes producing big effects, and you can have big changes in a system not producing any effect at all. And the thing is, you don't actually know when a particular cause is going to produce a big effect and when it won't, which makes prediction and management, as I say down at the bottom of this slide, very, very difficult. In part because of these characteristics, the first two bullets there, complex systems can flip from one pattern of behavior to another. They have multiple equilibria. In 2008, we went from essentially an inflationary global economic situation, and within just a few weeks, we flipped into another equilibrium, which we have not escaped by any means. We're constantly flirting with deflation and contraction in the global economy right now. So that just yesterday or the day before, the US Federal Reserve said it's going to continue buying $85 billion worth of bonds a month to continue to try to pump liquidity into the American economy and the global economy. We're in a very different situation. It's like we're in a different basin of attraction. We've gone to a different equilibrium, and it's very hard to get back to the original one. And we see this in things like ecological systems all the time. Just go to the east coast of Canada, talk to some folks in Newfoundland. So it's now, I think, 15, 18 years maybe since the cod fishery collapsed. People thought, well, we'll just wind down the fishing and it will come back to the way it was. Well, it hasn't. The system's reconfigured itself. Predator-prey relationships have changed. The ecology is different from what it was before. It's not going to go back to the way it was. You're not going to have those extraordinary cod fisheries. That was the most productive, in terms of biomass production, ecosystem on the planet, and it's gone. And complex systems have this extraordinary capacity to flip from one equilibrium to another, often unpredictably. You don't know when the last little thing is going to push it from one basin over a hill into another basin. So what's causing our economies and societies to become more complex? You know, I'm an academic. I could talk for hours about this, but I'll make it very simple. A very big part of it is this issue of performance improvements at the level of system units, organizations, people, technologies. They get better and better at doing what they think they need to do, and the overall result, and that's especially true, by the way, for information technologies, and the overall result is an increase in the complexity of the system. The person thinking about this is the economist W. Brian Arthur, and I'd highly recommend his work if you want to get a deep sense for what causes complexity. The result of this increasing performance ability at the level of system units, one result is that our networks, and these can be networks among individuals, among organizations, among corporations, among technologies, between technologies and individuals and corporations. But these networks have more nodes, the little orange things here, more connections. There's a greater density of connections between the nodes, and stuff moves along these connections, especially information, faster than ever before, which tends to produce a system that's increasingly tightly coupled. So if you shock one part of the system over here, it has very rapid consequences through the whole thing, like a row of dominoes falling over. Or, you know, a bunch of cars tailgating on the 401. And somebody makes a mistake, you know, they're looking at their iPhone or something like that, and it gets sideswiped, and before you know it, maybe there's a bit of fog, they all go into a bank of fog, and because there's not enough space between the cars, there's not enough slack, you have a 60-car pileup. It actually happens in the States fairly regularly, not as often here. Now, one of the results of the combination of simultaneous stresses and rising complexity is that we're moving, I believe, from a world of risk to a world of uncertainty. This is a distinction that was made originally by one of the most famous American economists in the early part of the 20th century, Frank Knight. He was at Columbia University. Was a bit later eclipsed by John Maynard Keynes. Interestingly enough, though, Keynes picked up on exactly this distinction and ran with it in his own work. So Knight distinguished between predictable risk and unpredictable risk, and he called unpredictable risk uncertainty, to make it very clear. So the idea basically is that in a world of risk, you can draw information from your environment that can give you a sense, if you're looking at a particular system, an economy, perhaps your corporation within an economy, a society, you have a sense for what the possible paths that system may go down in the future are, what those paths might be. And you also can have a sense for what the costs and benefits along each of those paths might be, because you've got sufficient evidence. In a world of uncertainty, you don't have enough evidence. Certainly, world of uncertainty, you certainly don't have enough evidence to make judgments about costs and benefits along particular paths, but you don't even know what the paths are. You don't know what pathways your system might evolve down, what those pathways might be. Now, this was a distinction that was highlighted very famously a number of years ago by the Secretary of Defense in the United States, Donald Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of Defense during the American invasion of Iraq. And things, as you know, didn't go very well in Iraq for the Americans, especially when they got to Baghdad. And he was in a press conference at one point talking about their difficulties in Baghdad, and he said, well, you know, we have known knowns, we have known unknowns, and we have unknown unknowns. And we happen to be in a situation in Baghdad of unknown unknowns right now. And the press, the media, had a field day with this. They declared that Don Rumsfeld had certifiably left the planet, that and the irony is that it was actually one of the smartest things he ever said, as Secretary of Defense, right? When you Google unknown unknowns, Rumsfeld's name comes up right away, but it was an idea that was out there for a long time. In a world of unknown unknowns, you're ignorant of your own ignorance. You're ignorant of your own ignorance. You don't even know what questions to ask. This is really profound. This is the kind of deep uncertainty and deep ignorance that Frank Knight was talking about. Now, it turns out the military folks actually get this. One of the reasons Rumsfeld talked about it, because he was always enamored of the military in the United States. He spent a lot of time hanging around people who've been in combat. And in the United States, people who've been in combat know this idea so well, and they use it so much that they shorten it. They call it UNKS, UNKS, right? Things happen on the battlefield you're not expecting. You go back and you look at the great military theorists' work, Karl von Clausewitz, his book On War, which he published in the 19th century, the Prussian military theorist. He talked about friction on the battlefield and the fog of war. There was complete recognition that if you're a military leader, you have to be prepared to deal with things coming out of the blue. Surprises shouldn't be a surprise. And that's the kind of world we're in now, in a world of deep uncertainty and unknown unknowns. And that means we actually need not only to adopt different kinds of institutions to respond to our challenges, but we need to educate folks in a different way to live effectively within that world. Let me say a few things about infoglut, and then I'll talk about what that education might look like. Now, I think the problem of infoglut is particularly acute in our modern, highly connected, IT-driven information technology, super-powered world. And this is the schema that I came up with. There's no underlying data for it, but I don't think it's probably too wrong, because when you're dealing with exponentials, you actually have a lot of latitude for error. I've got to be a bit fair, I've collected a lot of information about this, and there are different ways of measuring the amount of information we're transferring in our societies along those links between network nodes I talked about before. And it's probably reasonable to say that in the last 30 years or so, we've increased our capacity to send information hundreds of millions fold in our societies, hundreds of millions fold, right? Now, one thing that hasn't changed is this. This is still basically the same brain that hominids evolved. Probably stopped evolving, although there's some debate about this, but major evolution 40,000 years ago. So all that information is kind of piling up at the doorstep to our cerebral cortex. Meanwhile, we're in a world with increasingly complex problems, a turbulent world of rising complexity, of shock, of surprise, and we want to create deliberative citizens in a deliberative society to navigate their way through that world better. But this deliberation requires a lot of pretty fundamental things when it comes to dealing with information. We have to be able to absorb and sort and interpret large amounts of data. We have to comprehend that data's context and its significance given our particular goals. And to do all of that, and to sort of bring stuff together from a lot of different places and mix it together and try to figure out what's going on, to, again, interpret its significance, we have to have opportunities for reflection, thought, and conversation among us, because no one person or institution can effectively solve these problems and deliberate effectively by themselves anymore. And infoglut makes all these tasks harder, I would claim. I'll spend a little bit of time saying why. in part because the information revolution has vastly increased the power of information producers relative to information receivers. I'm going to unpack that point. Here we've got a kind of information pipeline from the production of information, the replication of information, the transmission of information to the storage, the management, and the use of information. So you've got producers and users in a general sense. And almost all of the innovation and extraordinary increases in productivity have occurred in the first section. We're much better at producing information. Replication is essentially free now. We can transmit vast amounts of it at very low cost. We're actually pretty good, better than we were even a decade ago at storing enormous amounts of this stuff. But when it comes to management, yes, okay, the Google search engines are pretty cool, but we're not going to make really significant advances in management of information until we have a lot of advanced artificial intelligence, bots that can actually, info bots that can sort through enormous amounts of information and determine what's important for us and what's not important. And in the end, we still got the human brain, which I wonder if that's the next slide. There it is. At the end of this process, that same hunk of meat that evolved 40,000 years ago. And it turns out that this human brain is actually a very slow information processor. I'm going to give you some data on that in a second. So I'll come back to that point. It's susceptible to availability bias. In other words, when we're making a judgment about something, we tend to draw on experiences that we've had very recently, that are fresh in our minds. We tend to look for monocausal explanations. This idea of multiple things coming together, causing a problem, or causing a particular circumstance that we have to deal with. It's amazing, I'm about to write a piece for the Globe and Mail on the monarch butterflies. I don't know if folks have noticed, but the monarch butterflies have disappeared. There are no monarch butterflies this year. Gone. Not quite. A lot of walking in the countryside around Fergus in central Wellington. I've seen 2. Normally see hundreds. 2, right? So that's a problem that is classic multi-causal problem. It's got something to do with farmers, industrial farming practices and use of pesticides, the elimination of milkweed by very large tract farming, the cutting down of the wintering grounds, forests in Mexico, and probably climate change and the terrible drought that's been experienced in Texas. There are lots of different things coming together there. But when you look at a conversation about what's caused the monarchs to disappear, everybody says, well, it's this, or it's that, or it's that, right? Everybody wants to point to a single cause. We have a lot of trouble looking for at developing an understanding and appreciation of multi-causal explanations, multiple causation. We tend to adjust easily to incremental change, which can be really bad news when the stresses are building up under the surface. And they're actually getting worse and worse, but you make these little adjustments, you don't really notice. Like the fact that we don't really notice the skies aren't blue anymore. It gets to a point in places like China where everybody notices, yeah, we're really sick. But it takes a long time, and we can adjust to a lot of incremental change and not really see it, not really remember what it was like in the past. That's related to the availability bias issue. And then finally, we discount the future, often very heavily. Future costs and benefits don't weigh very heavily for us. So, for instance, we don't really think very much sometimes about whether our acceleration down the 401 and pumping vast amounts of carbon dioxide out our exhaust pipe is going to have a consequence for our children 50, 60 years or 100 years from now. But let's go back to this issue of the ability of the brain to process information. This is a quotation from my book, The Ingenuity Gap. The optic nerve has I'll just read it for those folks who might have trouble reading. The optic nerve has a potential transmission capacity of 400 million bits of information a second, which is about the amount of information in 50 copies of this book. So the book, The Ingenuity Gap, is about 400 pages long. But peak processing rates within the brain, measured in tasks like piano playing and reading random words, average around 20 to 25 bits per second, which is a little more than the information contained in the last 3 letters of this word, O-R-D, right? So how do we survive? Well, psychologists have learned that it's because we take an enormous amount of stuff for granted. We chunk information. And as I'm standing up in front of you right now, I'm not actually paying attention to what's going on over here. I can't do that. I have to think about what I'm going to say next. And so I'm just kind of assuming that what's happening over here is what happened the last time I looked over here, which was 10 minutes ago, and my brain just says, okay, I'm going to hold that constant. And we also combine big chunks of processing together and treat them as single units. And that allows us to work more effectively with a very slow processor. So for information users, infoglut causes things that aren't very good for a deliberative society or a deliberative person. Decreased processing depth, thin slicing, to use the term Malcolm Gladwell used. We make our decisions very fast. We look at something and we decide. We switch between tasks, task switching. There's no such thing as multitasking. You switch tasks. You change your mind from one thing to another thing, and then you come back. You don't actually run your head in parallel, no matter how much you think you do. And when you're awash in information, you try to take a little chunk of it and focus really hard on it. This is a kind of hyper-specialization in a world of overwhelming amounts of information. And all of this stuff can increase stress. For society, those things were for individual. For society, infoglut causes excessive reliance on identity tags. One of the people who I spoke to when I was coming here is called a credentialization. So this is, you know, if you can't spend a lot of time looking at somebody in detail or an organization in detail to find out what they're about, how they perform and things, you want that little tag. It's like a GRE score or an LSAT or something like that, or a certificate that says, okay, this person's credible, I can go with them. Or this organization's okay or not okay. So we try to reduce everything to these very simple metrics, which you can call credentials of various kinds, to allow us to process things faster. We have managers and decision makers who are facing constant overload. I hear this from professionals all the time, for instance, in the federal and provincial governments and the senior levels of bureaucracy. They say this is a completely different world from the way it was 20 years ago. Most of the time we're in catch-up. Almost all the time we're in catch-up. We're running from one crisis to another. And ultimately, lower ingenuity supply. We have poor decisions and poor public policy as a result. So, that all sounds pretty grim. What can we do? And this is where we get, in the last part of my talk, 5 or 10 minutes or so, we get to the issue of liberal arts colleges and what our responses should be. And I have two, and I identified two responses that I want to talk about, and I identified them before. One is the issue of enabling or cultivating a prospective mind, and I'll talk about what that is. The other is enlarging the social space for deliberation. We'll come back to that in a moment. So what do I mean by a prospective mind? This is a different kind of education. This is an education where you try to provide the individual with much more autonomy and ability to navigate their way in a world of unknown unknowns, where information may be sparse, systems are complex, and they have to experiment a lot and learn on the go, change their ideas as they learn new things, because the world is changing around them so fast. So a prospective mind is open to reason and evidence, hopefully, has a street sense for science. This is where it's really important, for instance, in the climate change debate and the oil sands debate, that people actually have a bit of a comprehension for the basic science at play. They don't need to know the details, but they do need to be able to say, to have an intuition for when something's being said that just doesn't make sense. This doesn't work for me. I need to do a little bit more research, but I don't think this is right, what this person is saying. So when somebody comes along and says, carbon dioxide doesn't have any warming effect on the planet, somebody with a street sense for science should say, well, you know, not only appears to be a vast body of evidence going back over a century or more that suggests that carbon dioxide does trap infrared radiation in the atmosphere and warms the planet, But there are certain correlations we've seen with increasing carbon dioxide and increasing temperature. And there's some variation around those trend lines, but there does seem to be something well grounded in the statement that carbon dioxide is contributing to warming. So they don't have to know for sure what the reasons and evidence are, but they have to have an intuition for what sounds right. Somebody with a perspective mind remains flexible in response to constant change. They sort of lean forward on their feet, so they aren't surprised by surprise. In fact, they might actually, and this is kind of a temperamental thing, it may be to a certain extent about the way some people are wired, but they might actually find that surprise and crisis produce opportunities on the bottom line there. They might get excited by the fact that the world's always changing around them because they see new things happening and possibilities for, in a sense, new adventures in this world. They're curious about ideas and facts, and they constantly experiment, and they realize that the biggest lessons are learned from failure. And when we look back in our lives, and I think this is probably true for even the younger people in the audience, we all know that our biggest lessons have come from our biggest failures, the ones that really hurt. Now, what we want to ensure in a society that's resilient is that as individuals or organizations learn those lessons, they do their experiments and fail, that the information about what works and doesn't work is actually propagated as much as possible through the society so others can learn without having to go through the same experiments. But that the heart of a prospective mind and a resilient society is constant experimentation and excitement about experimentation. So the prospective mind is a resilient mind. This is a concept I talk about a lot. Resilient people, businesses, and societies can withstand shock without falling apart. They have the capacity for self-reliance, and they're creative in response to novel challenges. So very similar idea, really. The prospective mind and resilience is sort of psychological resilience, you might call it. And I think we can unpack this notion of prospective mind a little bit further and talk about some very fundamental conceptual shifts that have to occur for somebody to have, and I'm not sure if there's somebody with an exemplary prospective mind. I'm not even sure that I have an exemplary prospective mind, but I have a sense for what it would involve. And I think that these four things are pretty fundamental, four conceptual shifts in our world as complex, in large part, not mechanical in a way that I described before. Seeing the self, not as we're defined by conventional economists as consumers, but seeing ourselves as problem solvers, first and foremost, within our local communities, within our households, within our societies. Because this notion that we're often told that our, frankly, our principal economic role in the world is to consume stuff makes us very passive. It doesn't make us lean forward into problems and engage with them to solve them prospectively. Knowledge, our conception of knowledge has moved from a notion of specialized knowledge to a notion of integrated knowledge. And of course, liberal arts colleges and liberal arts educations are very important in this area. The greatest teachers that I've ever known are the ones who are able to bring ideas together from diverse places and make them connect. And I'll talk about this a bit more in just a second because it's very important. And then finally, values. We need to shift from what are often considered utilitarian values to moral and existential values, at least emphasize the latter two more. And I'll just say just a moment what I mean by that. I think that we really do have three general notions of value in our everyday conception of value. But there's one that's dominant. Again, I think conventional economic theory makes it dominant. And that's this notion of simple preferences or utilities. The idea that I value, for instance, vanilla ice cream more than chocolate ice cream. These are simple likes. And you can think of it as in terms of a scale of utilities. Chocolate ice cream provides me with the utility of 3, and vanilla ice cream provides me with the utility of 6 on a scale of 0 to 10 or something. And I think those notions of value, utilitarian notions of value, are very useful. But there are at least two others that tend to get short shrift within our conversations, our democratic conversations, one more so than the other. Moral values we do talk about in some respects, certainly central to our conversation to the extent that we're having a conversation about the Syrian situation. These are issues of justice and fairness in terms of our relationships with other people, perhaps other biota on this planet. Occasionally we think in those terms, or between people we're observing, such as in Syria. So this is fairness and justice. And then finally, existential and spiritual values. These are values that relate to our positioning in the cosmos, what the meaning of life is, the kind of things that we used to think about and ask questions about when we were, say, younger than 10, and we were often, adults responded to us by saying, we don't really know what the answers to those questions are, so go to your church or your mosque or your synagogue to get the answers to those questions. But you'd go into your local church, mosque, or synagogue, and you'd find that you were given a creed, not an opportunity to explore some of these larger existential value questions, such as what is the good life? What is the relationship between human beings and nature, the appropriate relationship? In particular, the existential and spiritual values are not discussed. We leave that as a private terrain that we're not willing to have public conversations about. And to the extent that we don't talk very much about the moral values and existential values in our public conversations, the conversation about simple preferences fills up all the space. And we deal with our angst, our moral angst and existential angst, by going to the mall. And that's not where we need to be in a deliberative society. This is my last slide. So the second thing we need to do is enlarge the social space for deliberation. It looks like there's a lot on this slide, but it's not too bad. Using ideas, places, and technologies. So each of these little paragraphs fits with one of these words. The first is about ideas, the second is about places, and the third is about technologies. And this is, you can see how a liberal arts education would contribute to creating in students some notion of a perspective mind, as we've talked about it. And we can also see how a liberal arts education and liberal arts colleges, such as Huron College, create a space, a social space, for deliberation. Because stimulating the growth of a diverse and complex knowledge ecology. I mentioned this idea when I was talking to the folks who invited me, and they responded to it immediately. And the key idea here is that rapid innovation comes from combinations of things in unexpected ways. Ideas, technologies, institutional forms. But what you want to do, especially in an educational environment, is create diversity of ideas and create the opportunity for those things to connect in ways that people aren't expecting or students aren't expecting in their heads. The second, a social space for deliberation, should include network hubs or nodes that provide the time and place for reflection and conversation. Slow down, stop the information inflow for a while so that you can have a moment for reflection, for conversation with each other about the problems and challenges that we're facing. And then, to the extent that information technology is exploited, and I think it has to be because it's remarkably powerful, we need to try to figure out ways that it encourages productive social engagement and the development of what you might call collective intelligence. We have an expert in collective intelligence sitting at the front of the audience here, Mark Tovey, who's literally written a book on it. How can we use these extraordinary technologies and social media apps, for example, like Twitter and Facebook, not to reduce the quality of our public conversation and our deliberation, and divide everything up into little bits of information that are disconnected from each other, disaggregate our society into little tribes of people who all think the same way and are interested in the same thing, but instead encourage integration across ideas and knowledge and integration across diverse communities. Now, I'm not sure exactly what the answer to this is. It's something that we've been talking about a lot as part of the Complexity Institute at the University of Waterloo, and Mark has been involved with that. But we need to figure out how, and maybe some of the, how to use information technologies to create true collective intelligence. Maybe some of the principles and ideas and institutional designs that have been developed in the open source movement are going to be very powerful. Maybe some of those principles and ideas that have been used in things like Wikipedia could be used for very large scale, democratic problem solving involving maybe even tens of millions of people. Whether that's possible or not, we don't know, but that's the kind of thing that we would need to do to more effectively deliberate in response to these extraordinary challenges we have today. So, just to conclude, just to bring it back to a personal note, those are my children. So Sarah and I have a little girl, Kate, you see on the left there. She's now 5. This was taken a couple of years ago. And Ben, who's in behind, who's 8. So there are some parents in this room, I expect, although a number of people who aren't. But I can tell you as a parent, I came to parenthood reasonably late in my life. Ben was born when I was 48, Kate when I was 52. As a parent, you suddenly develop a very intimate connection to the future. When you look at your children, it's like you're looking in through a window 80 years into the future. But it's all very foggy out there because it's a world of unknown unknowns. We don't really know what's going to happen. But we certainly know enough to be really concerned. I'm deeply worried about the future for my children. And that's where this little diagram comes on the right-hand side, this map. So this is an indication using current models of what the world might look like towards the end of Kate and Ben's life in 2080 or so. That's their life expectancy will take, by actuarial terms, takes them out to 2080, 2090, maybe 2095. And what we're seeing here is all those areas in red that you see. By 2080, we'll have a 90 to 100% chance of being warmer in any given summer than any summer in that region recorded to date, right? Notice that there are billions of people living in those areas, and some of the most important breadbasket and food production areas in the world are in those red areas. This is a prescription for an extraordinary civilizational global catastrophe later this century. And so I look at my kids and I think, is this the world they're going to be in? I don't think it has to be, but I think we need to make some very profound changes in the way we are engaging with these extraordinary challenges we're facing, such as climate change. And I think part of those changes will involve things like developing the capacity for a perspective mind, increasing our rapid innovation rate, especially with collective intelligence, creating spaces for effective deliberation and problem solving. I still think that there's an opportunity that our children, the children who are being born now, if we do these kinds of things, can have the same possibility for flourishing that everybody in this room has experienced already in their lives. Thank you very much.